If you believe that betrayal wears its most convincing face at family dinners and on ordinary Tuesday mornings when everything looks exactly as it should, then stay with me, because this story is going to reach right through your screen and grip you somewhere quiet. If that's the kind of truth you need tonight, subscribe to Ivory Secrets. We tell the stories that don't make it to polite conversation, and drop the name of the city where you're watching from right now in the comments. I want to see how far across this country these words travel tonight. Because this story starts in Toronto, and it ends with something no one saw coming, not even the woman at the center of it. Celeste Fontaine walked through the front door of her own home at 3:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, 14 hours before she was supposed to. The flight from Montréal had been cancelled due to weather, then uncancelled, then delayed, and she'd spent the better part of 6 hours in the terminal at Pierre Elliott Trudeau International rescheduling calls and drafting emails on her laptop. By the time the wheels touched down at Pearson, she was exhausted in the specific way that only air travel and betrayal can produce. Although at that point she only knew about the first one. The mover's truck was parked crookedly in front of the house. She stood on the front walkway and looked at it. A white cube truck with the ramp extended to her door. 2 men in gray coveralls were carrying her grandmother's writing desk, a piece of furniture that had survived 2 provinces. And a cross-country move when Celeste was 9 years old, down the front steps as though it were an ordinary piece of curbside furniture. And then she saw the brooch. Brigitte Pelletier was standing in the entrance hall, wearing Celeste's late mother's silver brooch, the one with the blue tourmaline stone, the size of a thumbnail, the one her mother had worn to every Christmas dinner. For 30 years the one Celeste had been unable to look at for the first full year after the funeral without feeling the floor tilt beneath her. Brigitte was wearing it pinned to the lapel of a cashmere blazer Celeste didn't recognize, and she was smiling. Beside her, with his hands in his jacket pockets in the careful way he always had when he'd already decided how a room was going to go, stood Xavier Holbrook. 15 years of marriage. Celeste had memorized this man the way you memorize a language. Not in any single moment of learning, but through daily immersion, through repetition, through all the ordinary Tuesdays, when you stop noticing you're fluent. She did not recognize the look on his face. "You're home early," Brigitte said, and there was something in her voice, not guilt, not even surprise, that landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Take that off," Celeste said. She was not speaking to Xavier. Brigitte's hand rose to the brooch the way a person reaches for something familiar. "Celeste." "That is my mother's. Take it off right now." "We should talk," Xavier said. He stepped forward in that measured way he had, already positioning himself above the situation. "Come inside. Let's handle this like adults." Celeste did not move from the doorway. She was looking at the cube truck, at the ramp, at the 2 men in gray who had stopped moving and were watching, with the cautious stillness of people who sense they have walked into something much larger than a job. Xavier, whose idea were the movers? That's not the point. I've been in Montreal for 4 days. You don't hire a cube truck in 4 days. When did you book them? Something moved across his face, too fast to name, but she filed it away anyway. "I wanted a clean break," he said. "I thought if the transition was already underway." "How long?" Celeste said, not a question. He didn't answer. She turned to Brigitte. "How long?" Brigitte's chin lifted almost imperceptibly, and underneath the performance of reluctance, Celeste saw something she had been too close to notice for years. Not guilt, patience. The particular patience of a person who has been waiting for their moment. 2 years, Xavier said. The number didn't land the way she expected. She'd braced for it to hurt, and it did. But the hurt was different from grief. It was the cold, specific clarity of finally understanding something that had been true for a very long time without her knowledge. 2 years, which meant that last January, when her father's estate had finally been settled, and she'd cried in the car on the way home from the lawyer's office, and Xavier had held her hand across the center console. He was already sleeping with her oldest, which meant that when Brigitte came over the following March, made tea, and sat with Celeste at the kitchen table for 3 hours while Celeste sorted through her mother's things, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to hold. Brigitte had already been there for over a year. "You sat with me for 3 hours," Celeste said. She was just saying it out loud, testing whether the world could really be this particular shape and still keep turning. "Going through my mother's things," while I cried, "And you were all ready." "Don't," Brigitte said, and for the first time something real crossed her face, but it wasn't remorse. It was irritation at being made to hold the image. "You were always working," Brigitte said. Her voice had settled into that register Celeste recognized, the one that sounded like honesty and functioned like a blade. "You were never really here, Cel. You know that. The marriage was already over. You can't steal something from a house that's already empty." Celeste absorbed this carefully. "I was working," she said slowly, "because someone in this family had to, because when the Ridgeline acquisition hit regulatory delays, someone had to be in those rooms. Someone had to keep 240 employees' pension contributions funded, and the lodges staffed, and the suppliers paid on time. That someone was me, not you. Not Xavier." Xavier's jaw tightened. She knew that muscle intimately. "That company," he said, "is not just yours. I've sat in those boardrooms for 15 years. I have shaken those hands. Half the investors in Fontaine Hospitality Group trusted this company because of the profile I helped build alongside IJU. I've spoken to a lawyer. In this province after a marriage this long, I am entitled to half the company, half the portfolio, and this house." He let that sit in the air between them. Celeste set her carry-on down on the hardwood floor. She did it slowly, deliberately, because her hands had begun to shake and she was not prepared to let either of them see it. Then she said the thing that changed the temperature of the entire room. "Xavier, do you know who owns this house?" He frowned. "We do, after 15 years. I'm asking you a factual question, not a theory your lawyer sold you this week. The deed to this building. Whose name is on it?" Something uncertain moved behind his eyes. "Yours, presumably, or ours?" "Neither," Celeste said. Brigitte looked between them. For the first time, the ease drained out of her posture. "She's stalling," Xavier said. "I'm not. This house does not belong to me, Xavier. It belongs to the Fontaine Family Trust. So does the controlling interest in Fontaine Hospitality Group. So does every major asset you've just instructed lawyers to pursue. The trust was established by my father 8 years ago, 3 years into our marriage, while you and I were celebrating our anniversary in Prince Edward County, and you believed everything was exactly as it appeared." She paused. "My father warned me before I walked down the aisle," he said. "Love a person with your whole heart, but don't hand them the keys to your family's history until you are certain they are there to protect it. I thought he was being unkind to you. I cried about it, and I spent 15 years waiting for the moment I would be certain enough to bring you fully inside." She picked up her carry-on. "Today gave me my answer." She walked past both of them, down the hall, into her father's study, and closed the door. Her hands were shaking in earnest now, so she pressed them flat against the surface of his old desk, a battered thing from his first accounting office that she'd refused to replace, and held them still by force until the trembling stopped. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person she knew would answer on the first ring, no matter the hour. "Cess," said Declan Ward, just her name, warm, steady enough. "I need you to tell me something," she said. "The Fontaine Family Trust, is it airtight?" A pause. She heard him sit forward. "Tell me what happened." "Just answer the question first, Xavier. Divorce. Can he touch the trust assets?" "Your father and I designed that trust to be indivisible in a marital dissolution," Declan said, and his voice had shifted. Still warm, but precise now, the way a blade is precise. "Xavier Holbrook has exactly as much legal claim to Fontaine Family Trust assets as the mail carrier who delivers to your door, which is none, not complicated, not borderline, none, a beat. Celeste, what happened?" And Celeste, who had held herself completely still through the entrance hall and the brooch, and the 2 years, and the movers, finally let her voice break. just once, very quietly, in a room where no one could see. When she came out of the study, 20 minutes later, Xavier and Bridget were still in the hall, but something had shifted between them. They were no longer facing outward as a unit. They had turned slightly toward each other, beginning in the wordless way of people who have miscalculated together to quietly apportion blame. She watched them for a moment before she spoke. "You know," she said, "in 15 years of marriage, I never once heard you talk about me like something to be defeated." She looked at Xavier. "When did I stop being your wife and start being an obstacle?" He turned, and for the first time, the mask he'd worn all afternoon slipped entirely. What was underneath it was smaller than she'd imagined. "The day you stopped needing me," he said, "I woke up every morning next to a woman who had everything managed, who didn't need a co-pilot, who flew the whole plane and let me sit in a seat with my name on it, but no function. You don't know what that does to a person." "So this is my fault," Celeste said. "I was too capable. I managed the crisis without falling apart." "I'm not saying it's your fault." "You didn't have to." She shook her head. "Xavier, if you had come to me and said, 'I feel sidelined, I feel useless,' I would have given you a division to lead. I would have restructured the whole make room for you. You had a place beside me. I built it. All you had to do was not do this." She opened the front door. Morning light came in clean off the street. "Declan Ward will be here within the hour. Once he arrives, this becomes a legal matter. I'd recommend you both be gone before then." They went, not gracefully. Xavier muttered about lawyers, about rights, about how far from over this was. Brigitte walked out with her arms folded across herself, the brooch still on her lapel, until Celeste said simply, "Leave it," and Brigitte's fingers found the clasp and slid it free and held it out on her open palm. Celeste took it, closed her hand around the cool weight of it, and stood in the doorway and watched them walk down the front path toward their car. And she did not cry, and she did not shout, and she did not feel the relief she had imagined she might feel. She felt the specific gravity of something ending, and underneath it something else, quiet, unnamed, beginning. Declan arrived in 40 minutes. He found her sitting on the staircase, the brooch in her hands, and he didn't say anything at all. He sat down to 2 steps below her and waited. "They planned this before I left for Montréal," she finally said. "I know." 15 years, Xavier. 30 years, Brigitte. I've known her since secondary school. Her voice was careful. She sat at my kitchen table and helped me sort through my mother's scarves. She held my hand while I cried, and she was all ready. "I know." They sat together in the quiet of the staircase for a while. Then Declan shifted and said, "I need to ask you something. As your lawyer, not your friend, is there anything Xavier knows? Anything he sat in on, had access to, that could damage the company if it went somewhere it shouldn't?" Celeste went very still. "The Ridgeline acquisition," she said. "He was in every meeting for the past 14 months. He knows the ceiling. He knows the walkaway number. He knows the entire financing structure." She paused. "If any of that reached Dunmore Group before the deal closed, the deal collapses. You lose the lodges, and most likely $180 million in projected value overnight." "He wouldn't." She stopped, because 3 hours ago she would have said he would never book a cube truck while she was on a business trip. It would destroy the very thing he's claiming he wants half of. Declan looked at her steadily. "Unless he doesn't want half of it. Unless someone at Dunmore Group has already offered him something more valuable than half your company, in exchange for the information that kills your acquisition before it closes." The blood left her face. "You think he's already made a deal? I think a man who books a moving truck 4 days out, runs a 2-year affair, and marches into his wife's entrance hall, demanding half of everything, doesn't do that unless he believes he has leverage she doesn't know about." Declan leaned forward. "The divorce, the movers, the confrontation. Celeste, what if all of that is the performance? What if the real move is the one you haven't seen yet?" She stood. The trembling had stopped. Something had settled behind her eyes that Declan recognized from years of watching her across boardroom tables. I need every email he was copied on in the last 2 years, she said. Every meeting, every document he had access to. I want to know every contact he's had with anyone at Dunmore Group, calendar, phone records, everything we can legally access. Some of that will take time to compile. Then start now. He gave us cause the moment he walked into that hall and threatened the company. She looked at Declan. He wanted this to be about a marriage. He thought, if he made it personal, I'd fall apart, and he could take everything while I was on the floor. But he didn't just betray a wife. He threatened 240 employees and a company my father spent his career building. That changes what this is. It does. Declan paused. What about Brigitte? She's had internal access to the offices for 6 years. If Xavier needed a document he wasn't authorized to pull, he'd need someone with credentials no one would question. Celeste had already reached the same conclusion. Put the digital access system under full forensic monitoring. Every login, every file accessed, every keystroke. Starting tonight. She was already moving toward the study. 3 days later, at 11:47 in the morning, while Celeste was sitting in a conference room on Bay Street, watching Xavier's lawyers turn the pages of the Fontaine Family Trust founding instrument with the careful expressions of people, reading something they had not expected, her phone buzzed quietly against the table. An alert from the monitoring system. Brigitte's credentials had just accessed the Ridgeline acquisition file. Celeste looked at the alert, set the phone face down, and continued, in the same unhurried tone, explaining to Xavier's lead counsel why there was nothing in the trust to divide, nothing in the company to claim, and no legal principle in the province of Ontario that would change either fact. When the meeting ended, Xavier's lawyers exchanging glances, his borrowed confidence visibly hollowing out. She picked up her phone in the elevator and sent one message to Declan. She accessed the Ridgeline file 10 minutes ago. Let her finish. Record everything. Because Brigitte, frightened after watching Xavier's plan come apart in the conference room, had gone to cover her tracks. She had logged into the same workstation she'd used 6 weeks earlier when Xavier needed the acquisition numbers and had needed someone on the inside to pull them. And she was deleting the access records that proved she'd done it. She did not know that every keystroke she made was being captured, time-stamped, and preserved in real time. She thought she was erasing her own footprint. She was, in fact, paving a road directly to herself. Celeste gave her 11 minutes. 11 minutes to delete every record she could find. And then she sent the forensic log to Declan, to the board, and, because she had held an evidence folder in reserve, since the morning the monitoring system first flagged Xavier's emails to an acquisitions contact at Dunmore Group to the appropriate regulatory authority. Xavier had made his threat in writing. 7 weeks before to director in the entrance hall. He had sent an email to a director at Dunmore Group, the company Fontaine Fatali for the Ridgeline Lodges, offering, in his own words, useful insights regarding a transaction currently in progress in exchange for a conversation about mutual opportunity solved. His personal situation. That was the phrase he'd used for 15 years of marriage. The email had been forwarded to Celeste by the director himself, a man she'd met twice at industry conferences, who apparently possessed more integrity than the husband she'd trusted with her whole life. The same afternoon he received it. She had known for 7 weeks. She had said nothing, had gone about her work, had sat across from Xavier at dinner, had answered his questions about her Montréal meetings, had behaved from the outside like a woman who had no idea. She had not been performing ignorance, she had been building the case. The board meeting was a Thursday afternoon. 12 people around the table on the 14th floor. Her father's photograph on the wall. She'd had it brought up from storage that morning, and Xavier at the far end, still dressed like someone who believed the room was negotiable. He made his case. She had to give him that. 15 years of standing beside her had taught him the vocabulary of it. He used words like contribution and equity and partnership. He spoke about investors charmed, relationships cultivated, the profile he'd helped build. When he finished, Celeste stood. "Before the board votes," she said, "I want to give you one last opportunity, not for your sake, for mine. Because I was your wife for 15 years, and I need to be able to tell myself I gave you every chance to be the person I thought you were." She looked at him across the length of the table. "7 weeks ago you sent an email to an acquisitions director at Dunmore Group. In it, you offered confidential details about our Ridgeline transaction in exchange for a position at their firm. He forwarded that email to me the same afternoon he received it." She let that land. 7 weeks. "Xavier, I've known for 7 weeks. I sat across from you at dinner 4 days after that email was sent. You poured the wine, you asked about my meetings, and I said nothing because I was making certain that when this moment came, I had everything I needed, and you had nothing left." The room was absolutely still. "I'm not asking the board to imagine what was in your heart. I was clearly wrong about that for 15 years, and I won't make the same claim twice. I'm asking them to look at what is documented, the email. The forensic log showing Brigitte Pelletier accessing the Ridgeline file at 11:47 yesterday morning, and then attempting to delete those records 60 minutes later. Every deletion captured, time-stamped, preserved." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm asking the board to decide whether this is the character of a person who belongs anywhere near this company." The vote took less than 2 minutes. It was unanimous. She did not feel triumphant standing in the elevator afterward. She felt as though she had won a war and buried 2 people she had loved in the same afternoon, which she had, and those things did not cancel each other out. Declan was waiting in the lobby. "It's done," he said. "I know. Brigitte is cooperating with the investigation to limit her own exposure." She confirmed on the record that Xavier explicitly asked her to pull the Ridgeline file, told her it was for an internal review and that she knew it was not. He was careful with the next part. She knew Celeste. Celeste stood in the lobby light and felt the last version of her friendship with Brigitte close, like a door that had been slowly swinging shut for 2 years. "She sat with me for 3 hours going through my mother's things," she said, and she knew. Declan didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. "I want to go home," she said. "I want to sit in my father's study and not be the CEO for one night." "Go," he said. "I'll handle everything else." She drove home through the gray Toronto evening and walked through the same door where everything had come apart, and the house was quiet in a way that should have been unbearable, and was, somehow, just quiet. She sat in her father's study and held her mother's brooch in the lamplight and thought about 30 years in secondary school, and all the versions of themselves she and Brigitte had been. At some point, Declan called. "You're going to be all right," he said. "I know that's not particularly useful to hear right now." "I know I will be," she said. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about all the time she must have looked at me and thought she has no idea. And I'm thinking about how long I'll spend wondering if there was a version of this where I saw it sooner." "There wasn't," Declan said. "You didn't miss something hidden. The rot grew in a place you had no access to. You can't audit someone else's interior life, no matter how well you know them. What happened to you is not a failure of your judgment. It is a failure of their character. Those are different things, and the difference matters." She was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say something," she said. "The people who love you and the people who need you are not always the same people. And the day you confuse the two, you'll hand the most important things you have to someone who only wants to carry them out the door." He was right. He was. I just spent 15 years hoping he wasn't. She looked at the brooch in her hand. He built the trust because he knew I might love the wrong person more than I loved my own judgment. He built it because he loved me. And sometimes love looks like a wall built quietly while you're not paying attention. 8 months later, Brigitte sent a letter. It was long and carefully written, full of the familiar language she'd always used, the language of someone explaining why the things they had done were not quite they looked like. Celeste read it once, set it down, and understood that there would never be a version of the apology she needed. Brigitte was sorry she had lost. That was real. But it was not the same thing as being sorry she had tried. And Celeste was finished accepting those two things dressed up as each other. Xavier was quietly blacklisted from the hospitality industry, not through any action Celeste took, but through the natural consequence of an email sent in his own name to a competitor. There was a particular justice in that. His downfall written entirely in his own words, requiring nothing from her at all. She converted the upper floors of the house, the guest rooms that had sat empty for most of her marriage, the rooms she'd always thought of as eventually rooms, into a residency program for women rebuilding after major disruptions. Entrepreneurs restarting, women who'd lost businesses, marriages, years. The program was funded through the Fontaine Family Trust. It was the first thing the trust had ever done for anyone other than protect her, and she thought her father would have considered that a reasonable second purpose. Declan came to the launch evening. He stood beside her, not in front of her, not angling for acknowledgement in the write-up, and watched the room fill with noise and people and the particular energy of lives being rebuilt on purpose. And he said simply, "Your mother would have talked to every single person here and remembered all of their names." "She would have," Celeste said, "and she would have remembered them the next time, too." He smiled, and there was something in the quiet, after that neither of them named yet, because neither of them was in a hurry to name it. It was simply there, the way steady things are, not declaring itself, not asking for anything, just present. 1 year after the afternoon she came home from Montréal 14 hours early, Celeste Fontaine stood in the entrance hall of her house, the exact same spot where she'd stood, and watched her marriage and her oldest friendship come apart in the span of 1 hour. And she held her mother's brooch, and she understood something, that all of it, the whole terrible year, had been trying to teach her. Xavier had looked at this house and seen an asset to divide. Brigitte had looked at this life and seen a status she'd been standing beside too long without inheriting. Neither of them had ever seen what they were actually standing next to. The most valuable thing Celeste Fontaine owned had never appeared in any trust document. It had never shown up on a balance sheet. It was not the company, not the properties, not even her mother's brooch. It was what she carried into every room she walked into. The particular kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not perform, that holds on and stays and refuses, even under the most deliberate pressure, to become something smaller than it started. They had tried to take everything around it, and in failing they had handed it back to her, cleaner and more certain than it had ever been.